Mixed together in laboratories and sold on the streets, even in shops. The use of synthetic, supposedly recreational drugs is on the rise. Are they changing the fight against the drug trade? Hello from me, David Foster. Warm welcome to the programme. They are man-made, mind-altering narcotics that have exploded in popularity in recent years. Synthetic drugs, they mimic the effects of natural narcotics such as heroin, cocaine and cannabis. And the producers are harder to catch.
Drug traffickers thrive on being able to smuggle through national borders. But a new era of synthetic drugs is reshaping the global drug trade. This international industry has enriched organised crime gangs, with the market in drug trafficking reaching an estimated annual global value of between $426 and $652 billion. Drug policy experts and law enforcement have recorded a boom time for synthetic drugs. Narcotics made entirely in labs that often mimic the effects of plant-based drugs like spice or K2, synthetic marijuana that often puts users into a zombie-like state, or fentanyl, a synthetic opioid blamed for thousands of deaths in the US. These drugs are marketed online and often smuggled undercover via the global postal system, presenting a new challenge for law enforcement.
Our roundtable experts today are Alexander Soderholm from the London School of Economics International Drug Policy Unit. We have Neve Eastwood here, Chief Executive of Release, a national centre of expertise on drugs and drugs law. We cross to Washington, D.C. to say hello to Vanda Feldbab-Brown, an expert on global organised crime from the Brookings Institution. And in Devon in the United Kingdom, we have Ros Gittins, Director of Pharmacy at the drug and mental health charity Addaction. Great to have you all with us. Vanda, let me come to you first of all. You said this is the most disruptive innovation in the history of international drugs trade. What did you mean?
Well, specifically, I was referring to the rise of synthetic opioids, such as fentanyl and carfentanil. Synthetic drugs have been around for several decades, but what has radically changed over the past 10-15 years is the methods by which they can produce and the potency at which they can be produced. They have wreaked tremendous havoc in the United States and Canada and are starting to spread to other markets and can really spread globally. They have multiple effects in terms of public health. The chance of overdose that causes either death or lifelong morbidity is very high. But also they radically change how organized crime is organized and how it interacts with conflict. So traditional concepts of drug terrorism nexus are fundamentally changed by the rise of synthetic drugs. And one of the new dimensions, of course, is that production can spread to very wide areas. Currently, for the US, China and India are the major suppliers of illegal synthetic drugs, such as fentanyl and carfentanil. But we can very easily imagine, just in a matter of quick years, production spreading throughout Southeast Asia, also to places like South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, wide range of actors, not to mention traditional Latin American suppliers.
Ros, is this, or anybody indeed, but I'll come to Ros first of all, is this because it is so much easier to produce? With plant-based narcotics, you need land, you need a labour force. This is much, much easier.
So I think with the advent of technology, there's definitely more increased ability to be able to produce these newer agents. I think some of the challenges we equally see with them is actually then trying to, I guess, clinically manage people who experience then problems with these substances. And what they really bring with them is that sense of, to a degree, is that sense of unknown. And knowing what, how somebody may respond to particular these new novel drugs, and not necessarily knowing the effects that they will have in both the short and longer term. And for us as clinicians, trying to manage that is a real challenge for us.
Neve?
Yeah, I agree with everything Ros and Vanda have said so far. I think what's important to note with the synthetic market, that we're talking about those drugs that try to mimic traditional substances such as cannabis or the opioids or cocaine. Well, that's the meth cathinones. But often they don't take hold in markets. It's a very geographical experience. So yes, we've seen an increase in the use of synthetic opioids in the US and Canadian market, largely driven by, as Vanda pointed out, it's being produced in China but exported to Mexico, where it's being used by the cartels. Again, in Eastern Europe and Russia, where you don't see a natural flow of heroin getting into that region, you see use of these synthetic drugs. But in the UK, I think we have a very robust market in terms of the traditional substances. Cocaine, for example, is the cheapest it's ever been to import. So 5-10 years ago, a kilo of cocaine was £50,000. We're now seeing it at a region of £25,000 with purity rate at the highest level ever. That being said, we are seeing, say, for example, synthetic cannabinoids being used amongst very vulnerable populations, the homeless in the UK and in prisons.
Are you saying that the reason why these synthetics are not quite as much in demand in the UK is because traditional drugs, if you like, are here, they are cheaper, and they're of a reasonable quality?
Absolutely. I mean, the quality of drugs at the moment on the market, both heroin, cocaine, MDMA, is some of the highest purity rates we've ever seen on the streets of the UK. At the same time, you see areas of the world where it is harder to get traditional drugs to. So, for example, the Australian market, it's incredibly expensive cocaine, and that's why we see the use of more synthetic drugs. Similarly, in New Zealand.
Because you have to otherwise bring them across borders.
Absolutely.
If you smuggle them under a wall, if there happens to be one between Mexico and the United States, if you're coming from Mexico. Yeah, with these you don't. Sorry, if I could just bring in Alex first, and then we'll be back with you, Vanda, I promise you. I just want to get everybody in on the discussion.
Sure, yes. Interdiction is, of course, a key concern. It's one of the drivers of the innovation that we're seeing in the synthetic drugs market globally. It is one of the key unintended consequences of international drug control in terms of substance displacement, this emergence of new substances. If we look at the global synthetic drugs market globally, we're seeing two main drivers of its increase or of its enlargement. The first one being, as Vanda pointed out, the rise in synthetic opioids, so fentanyl and tramadol in particular.
And fentanyl, I'm no expert, but it is much, much stronger than morphine, yes?
Yes, it's much stronger than morphine and heroin, between 50 and 100 times stronger. And if we talk about carfentanil, for example, that's up to 1,000 times stronger than morphine and
So
heroin.
these are originally intended as pain relievers?
Yes, yeah.
And being sold for people to get high?
Yes,
blow
exactly.
their brains out effectively.
Well, if we look at something like tramadol, for example, which is a medicine, an opioid-based medicine designed to reduce pain, if we look globally, more than 75% of the world population lack access to pain-relieving medicines, and this is mainly in low-income countries. And so it's not a surprise that we see tramadol used mainly in Africa and the Middle East, in countries that have little access to pain-relieving medicines.
Vanda, sorry, I had to interrupt you. Please,
Sure.
what do you want to say?
I think it's much more complicated picture than to simply say that synthetic drugs have risen because there is a shortage of plant-based drugs. That's certainly not true in the United States at all. We too are seeing a glut of cocaine. There is plenty of availability of cocaine, low prices, very high purity due to massive levels of production in Colombia. And instead, what we are seeing is both users and dealers mixing fentanyl and synthetic opioids into cocaine. So yes, it could be true that under some circumstances, when a particular substance is suppressed, other illicit substances can rise as a result. But the dynamics are much more complex. Fads take place. There is also no shortage of heroin in the United States, yet we are still seeing the rise of synthetics. And the crucial dynamics here is that the dealers overwhelmingly prefer to peddle, to deliver synthetic drugs. Why? Because the price to weight ratio is so much different, is so much advantageous. So if you think of supplying the entire US market in cocaine for a year, you will need about 10 trailer trucks of cocaine, which is nothing given that every day several thousands, tens of thousands of trucks cross the US-Mexico border. But nonetheless, if you want to switch to supplying that entire market with fentanyl, you are talking about a tiny fraction of that. That also enables direct smuggling via post. A lot of our fentanyl from India and China comes directly via mail services. Only some portion of it comes via Mexico. In fact, not even the vast majority of it.
This is very hard to track. We don't seem to have either the international desire to cooperate about this or the means to find out where this is coming in and where it's going. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think with some of these newer agents, because there's less evidence around for them, and in terms of them being more easily detectable, it's more of a challenge both at the customs side of things, but also in terms of drug testing. If somebody's choosing to use some of these kind of newer substances, they could be more difficult to pick up on.
And equally, traditional drugs, let's call them that, if you like, the ones that we've had around for a long time, plant-based drugs, tend to come with them, if you like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Ros or anybody else. They seem to be associated with levels of violence, levels of coercion, obvious signs that they are there. And these ones don't leave behind perhaps the same sort of trail as the others.
We definitely see these newer synthetic agents being used in combination, occasionally displacing other drugs as well. So it's not exclusively one way or the other. I think it's a far more complicated picture than that.
But I had read that there were no associations, not many associations with violence, with terrorism, with organised crime. What do you think?
I mean, I'm not sure that we can say this, and I agree with Vanda's point that it is complex, and I was certainly not trying to simplify the situation. I'm just saying that within the UK at the moment, there is no sign that we are seeing the synthetic opioids coming on board. I think the level of human destruction that we are seeing with synthetic opioids in, for example, Canada and the US is
and in the Eastern Bloc of Europe as well.
Absolutely, is absolutely shocking. I mean, we are seeing levels of fatalities that are unprecedented. So there is, if you like, human cost to this. I think Vanda's probably better to speak to the market itself. But certainly, there is evidence to show that there was use of these substances, the synthetic opioids, by the Mexican cartels, and obviously the violence is associated there. And it's the point ultimately is these are very cheap, they are very potent, and they can serve a much greater market in terms of the quantity needed to satisfy that market.
Yeah,
and I think to add to that, Neve, as well, I'd also say that part of the things that we really get concerned about is this is affecting particularly vulnerable people as well.
Well, if I may, some of the research that we are doing recently at London School of Economics is looking at the production of synthetic drugs in areas of conflict and insecurity. And what we've seen over the past few years is an increase in methamphetamine production in Afghanistan and Myanmar in particular, that these trades might be very compatible with those wartime economies of those countries, but also the production of amphetamine-type stimulants in Syria, which has really expanded since the Syrian civil war.
Is that because of the breakdown of society, normal society rules in these countries? Because, of course, Afghanistan's long been associated with the opium trade and heroin trade.
Sure, it is one factor. Again, as you mentioned earlier in the program, the non-geographically based synthetic drugs that we're seeing emerge, they don't require the same type of labor inputs or the same type of areas. UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, often refers to these labs as kitchen labs. You don't necessarily need a degree in chemistry to be able to produce many of these substances.
Although if you're Walter White in Breaking Bad, it sort of helps. But that's the sort of thing we're talking about. Vanda, I did mention earlier that I had a question, and it relates to this. I went on the website of an organisation called Think Twice. And it talked about the fact that these drugs can be sold in pharmacies as not for human consumption, but people can go in still and buy them legally. And that is one of the reasons why this trade is doing so well. Why is that allowed?
Well, it depends on what substance we are talking about. So certainly drugs like tramadol have very significant, very important uses. They are a principal painkiller. Now, I am all for improving the quality of life and access to pain medication. I am also around the world, in the United States, in Africa, in many other parts of the country. I am also tremendously aware of how destructive overprescription of painkillers has been for the United States and is spreading.
Sorry to interrupt you. I do understand that, and we have done programs on it. But this is about pharmacies that say these are not for human consumption. They're labelled as plant food. They're labelled as herbal incense.
Oh, I
and yet
see.
they are sold to people who then go on to ingest them some way or another. Is it not time for greater checks at that end? I'll get the answer from Xander first and then come back to you, Neve.
Well, there is a need for far greater checks on the pharmacies and other forms of dispensaries. So the labeling or mislabeling is one typical form of clandestine hiding mechanism by which legal, semi-legal, outright illegal suppliers try to avoid rules and their enforcement. But the same issue is with drugs that are for human consumption, like tramadol. In theory, you should have a prescription for getting access to tramadol in places like Nigeria and India. In practice, you can walk to just about any pharmacy and put a $10 bill on the counter, and you will get a very large supply of tramadol, despite the fact that you don't have a prescription. And the same is with other drugs that are mislabeled.
Yeah, Ros, very difficult to get the message across. I note you say that the normal harm reduction messages that we give out are not relevant here.
So I think sometimes the harm reduction messages that we need to give need to be different. As I said, particularly with these newer substances when we don't necessarily know as much about the short and more longer term harms. Sometimes they need to be different in terms of how the substance may be used, for example, and especially when it comes to polypharmacy, i.e. mixing these substances, understanding the interaction between them. I think when it comes to things like labelling and selling these products, there's definitely a role for actually harm reduction advice being given at that point in time, so people are better educated about the potential risks that they're putting themselves at, and being clear about what that substance is and the likely content, not just that particular drug and its strength, but other additives, excipients that can be added to the mix as well.
You see, the thing is, what I'm wondering is, at the moment, there doesn't seem to be an internationally organised trade in this. It could be one little kitchen pharmacy here, it could be one little kitchen drug producing place there, etc., etc. But once the potential of these substances becomes widely known and it becomes easy to produce them, then organised crime is quite likely to move in. Are you seeing any attempts by that? I'm wondering, really, is there anybody starting to run this trade?
You mean certainly organised crime is involved in the supply of the synthetic opioids, and the idea, I think, this is a diverse market. You know, the traditional drugs are not necessarily just going to go away because of the synthetics. The question is, how do we respond to that? And you mentioned about the idea of people being able to go into pharmacy shops and to buy them as plant food. I mean, in the UK, we introduced the Psychoactive Substances Act in 2016, which seeks to ban these substances. Now, it doesn't list the substances, but what it does is define that any substance that interacts with the central nervous system falls foul of the Act. Now, it hasn't worked. What we've seen is these substances getting more dangerous for the user. We've seen not a decrease in the market. The market was never huge in the UK anyway, but it hasn't worked. So in response to kind of the international coordinated approach to this, we can't police our way out of the drugs market at the moment, and I think that's a really important thing for us to say.
To point out to a lot of
synthetics.
people here watching, Release over the years has advocated the lessening, if you like, of the restrictive laws on an awful lot of drugs.
Decriminalisation.
What would you do here?
Well, you mean, I don't think that we should be criminalising anyone who uses any illicit substance. That is a waste of police resources. And if we look at the statistics, 83% of prosecutions across the world for drug offences involves possession
Users,
offences.
but what about the producers here?
Well, for the producers,
it's hard to find them, isn't it?
We have to start to explore regulation. I don't think regulation is a silver bullet in and of itself. You know, Roz has mentioned the vulnerable populations that are using these substances. A lot of that is to do with our social policies. So, for example, the lack of access, and this is across the world, not just the UK, but the lack of access to income, the lack of access to housing, insecure lives. You know, it's a failure of government whenever we have problematic drug use. Problematic drug use is a form of trauma. It's someone who has suffered in their life and is self-medicating, whether it's a synthetic or it's a traditional
And Neve, I know
drug.
we've talked about that on other programmes, but we talk about the multitude of different substances out there.
Again.
I mean, there's been a list given on this programme. I even read of one called bath salts.
Right, sure. Yeah, between 2009 and 2016, we saw more than 105 countries and territories identify in excess of 730 new psychoactive substances. This is in a 7-year period. So this is really an unprecedented, policy challenge for international drug control. Again, we need to ask ourselves, what is it that we're trying to achieve with drug control? If it is so that we're trying to increase price and reduce availability, all academic evidence suggests that we have failed. Drugs are more highly available and cheaper than ever before globally. So we need to look at tackling organized violent crime. We need to look at tackling corruption, which is a key enabler of these illicit drugs trades globally. We can't legislate our way out of this problem. Nation states are simply not fast enough at regulating substances before new ones come out.
So what I'm wondering about, and this is the big question for me, is are we worried about this because of the physical dangers to people or because of the difficulty in policing it? And I'll go round the round table, if you like. Start with you, Vanda, on that one.
Well, we should be worried about both. It would be wrong to assume that policing and law enforcement does not play any role in drug control and, in fact, does not play a role in quality of life. I fully agree that users should not be criminalized. They should not be sent to prison. That doesn't, however, imply that there should be no role for enforcement. There is a very significant role for enforcement. The question is how we deploy it. For example, what we are seeing in many markets is that dealers add in substances such as fentanyl without even telling users. Those should be priority targets for law enforcement. In my view, it is very wise to prioritize law enforcement against the most potent synthetic opioids. That has many dimensions to it. Those are not simply criminal groups like some Mexican organizations such as Sinaloa Cartel or Jalisco Nueva Generación. In China, there are at least 5,000 chemical companies that produce drugs and about 150,000 factories that produce drugs, many of which illegally, in violation of both U.S. laws and Chinese laws, send them to the United States.
150,000. That is an extraordinary number. I want to move around as we come towards the end of the program, round the table. Neve, with you on this one. Which is the biggest danger?
Start policing them.
Vanda, thank you. Thank you very much. Which is the biggest danger, the health danger or the explosion in crime that this could generate?
I would agree with Vanda that they're both equally important. Yeah. I think the health harms of some of these synthetics, both the cannabinoids and the opiates, are particularly dangerous to people who use drugs. We see it on the streets of Britain every day. At the same time, I think we do have to tackle the reduction side of things. I agree with Vanda, there is a role for law enforcement, but I think in the long term, we also have to accept that law enforcement isn't able to deal with this market. The UK's own Home Office evaluation of the 2010 drug strategy looked at the effectiveness of law enforcement, and it clearly stated we spend 1.6 billion a year on law enforcement. That's almost 3 times on what we spend on treatment. And it has little to no impact on the market, and it describes the market as resilient.
Alex, I'm so sorry, we are coming to the end, and I want to come back to Ros in just a moment, since you deal with people who take these drugs a lot. How do we police it quickly?
Well, just echo what the former participants have said. We need to focus law enforcement capacity on tackling organized violent crime. We need to focus.
But that's not going to happen, is it? So this is just going to get worse.
Well, we need to look more at controlling precursors, for example, which is a little bit of a double-edged sword because we know producers move to new precursors a little bit.
This is what you need to start
exactly
the manufacturing process.
The baking powder of the cake, so to speak. Yeah. We need to look at controlling these more effectively and preventing diversion from the illicit pharmaceutical chemical industry into the illicit market, and also following the money. We need better checks and balances in terms of anti-money laundering practices. In 2012, we know that HSBC was fined $1.9 billion for laundering almost $900 million in Mexican and Colombian drug cartel money. These are things that we need to do.
Thank you so much. Ros, I do want to end with you. More and more people using these drugs, more and more people, you're at Action, more and more people who you have to deal with on a daily basis. Is it getting worse by the week?
So I think it is a continued challenge for us. I think there is a role in reviewing current regulation to see how that may be able to help things. Education, I think, I've already kind of mentioned as well. Also the need for more research into this, but also funding. And as you're probably aware, particularly here in the UK, our drug treatment services are commissioned via local health authority routes. And our funding has been significantly cut. So for us to manage a lot of what we're seeing and to provide safe, effective services, high quality services for these vulnerable people who essentially need our help continues to be a challenge.
I suppose 15 years ago you were dealing mostly with traditional drug users. Nowadays, what is the percentage of those who come to see you or you get to see dealing with synthetics?
So I think our more traditional substances like the opioids still, I would say, in general, predominate, likewise with alcohol. But we are increasingly seeing people presenting at treatment services with problems with these newer substances. And likewise, sometimes mixed in as well. Maybe they're using synthetic cannabinoid, for example, on top of other opioids or other more traditional drugs as well.
The authorities clearly do need to sit up and listen to what people like you are saying. Vanda, thank you very much indeed. Thanks to Ros also, and to Niamh and Alex. I hope your message gets across. Thank you for watching this edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster, and the team that made it all possible. We hope to have your company next time. Until then, goodbye.